This is the bit where we stare awkwardly and we see whether YouTube is actually working.
It's on.
No, it's working.
Mm.
It's happening.
It says there's one person watching, and that's me, I think.
What is it called?
Okay, I believe we are live. Thank you for your patience, folks. Technical problems because I was hosting, and therefore there's always technical problems when I'm hosting, so I apologize for that. Welcome to the Freedom Anarchist News Review. I'm your host for this evening, Mike, aka Punk Academic. It's not been a secret for a long time. And I'm joined by my colleagues and comrades this evening. Those of you who know author of the legendary book, really, French Anarchists in London, which tells us the tale of French anarchists and transnational exile in London in the late 19th century into the early 20th, and what those networks meant and how important they were for the development of anarchism more generally. And also a recent study of Jean Grave as well, which is a fantastic book, which I'd highly recommend. So, and I would also just generally recommend anything by her because it's fantastic. Also joined by our friend and comrade, John Bigger, who is a regular with us. So thank you, John, for joining us. I don't know if Russell's going to put in an appearance at some point, but
He's
if he does,
snoozing. He's snoozing.
he's one of the anarcha cats, as I like to call them. He's one of the anarchist tabby cats, and I have one of my own, or rather, she has me, and Nicola, my partner. So anyway, without further ado, welcome to the Freedom Anarchist News Review. We're delighted you've joined us, or if you're watching this later, you'll join us later. Tonight we've got a fair few things to talk about from an anarchist perspective. We'll probably crystallising around a few issues, chief amongst which, right in front of our eyes, all across the world, is obviously the situation in Iran at the moment and in the wider Middle East. And there's something we've been following on Freedom. Obviously, we've had a story this week from one of our contributors looking at the notes from the US situation and the US perspectives on Iran. Clearly, we've got John here, so also we've got UK perspectives on Iran, on the Iran war as well, and what that means in terms of the UK's positioning, and obviously France and Europe's positioning on the Iran crisis as well. And also, we're going to look a little bit tonight, given we've got Constance here, we've got Constance's expertise. We're going to look at some stories that have been coming out of France, particularly around some issues around the ways in which the anti-fascist left has been demonized in recent times, in recent weeks, and been marginalized within public debate and rhetoric in a way that is deeply concerning and disturbing, particularly at this time when much of French electoral politics is balanced on a precipice, really. So that's some of the stuff that we're going to look at tonight. If we've got any more time, we might get into some other stories that we've covered in Freedom this week. But I will start, if I may, with the top line story, which is obviously what's happening in Iran right now. And I suppose the place to start is really right off the bat where we're at right now. I mean, I don't know if anyone's got any views on where we are now versus where we were 2 weeks ago, which I believe is the last time we had an opportunity to discuss this. But, the sense that I'm getting, and this is possibly a superficial sense, but the sense that I'm getting is not only do they not have a plan, they very, very clearly do not have an exit strategy.
Mm.
And as a consequence of that, we seem even more so than usual, and we anarchists would think this is often usual. We are even more so than usual in this sort of nightmare of total disruption, chaos, and mass death, which obviously could have been avoided very easily, but nonetheless is happening right now. And it seems deeply concerning about where this might go next. Clearly, the last 24 hours, we've seen strikes on major energy
Mm.
supplies and gas fields and so on, and that seems to be escalating the situation. I don't know if either of you want to chip in with your take on what's gone on over the last 2 weeks, apart from the fact that it's been an absolute nightmare.
Well, I was last on 3 weeks ago, just before it started. It's been going 20 days now. And just before we started, I was watching a press conference where Benjamin Netanyahu was talking. And one of the things he said is that Israel and America are creating the background to a possible uprising by the Iranian people. And I thought to myself, are you? Is that what you're doing? Are you sure that's what you're doing? Because I think what we said last time, 3 weeks ago when I was on, was that even with all of those protests and everything that were going on in the months leading up to this in Iran, it didn't look like the regime was destabilized. They looked like they were ready for those protests and they were dealing with those protests. What has been, I think, very surprising to me, at least, maybe because I don't know so much about Iran, in detail, is just how solid that regime is. I mean, it's terrifying, and I've seen reports of how well embedded they are in the citizenry, and for a revolution to take place, you need the army and the police being ready to stop firing on their own people and stop attacking their own people. And I'm not sure that bombing civilians, because civilians are dying in this, is the way to produce those conditions for a revolution. And it actually might reinforce the regime no matter how many people in control you kill, because they can be replaced. They are that embedded. There are so many people in the hierarchy of the regime. It could, of course, go the other way. And Netanyahu might be right, but how do they know? How do they possibly know that they're creating the foundation for revolutionary action? It certainly doesn't look like that. That's my first salvo.
I mean, I wonder, there's two things that come out of that to me, John. I completely agree with everything you say. I think the first one is, how serious were they really anyway about China promoting uprising? It was almost like not a casual thought. When Trump made that comment about you should rise up and overthrow the regime and so on. The US does this all the time, of course, and then habitually betray the people that it urges to rise up against whoever they don't like at that given time. How serious they were about trying to promote that, I don't know. And then the second piece around the point you make about Netanyahu and what Netanyahu's aims are in this. Clearly I'm not a student of Israeli politics in any detail, and I'm not a student of Iranian politics in any detail. But at the same time, the issue around, a lot of attention on the US angle has focused heavily on this is a distraction. This is spectacle. Obviously, got the cost of many people's lives to distract from something that Trump is trying to ignore at home, which obviously is the Epstein files that we all know about, and the crisis that was building for him over that. But also the fact that Netanyahu's political survival, certainly for the last few years, has depended essentially on being in constant state of war, effectively, because clearly we know when Gaza was starting up in terms of the genocide in Gaza, when that was starting, when that situation was happening, there was clearly there was issues in the courts with Netanyahu and so on, and there was all sorts of domestic political problems that Netanyahu had. And there's been an argument, certainly by some in the peace movement in Israel and on the Israeli left, that this is just permanent war. It is what's necessary as well. So in a way, they are very different people, but at the same time, they have a similar interest in different ways. And conflict is good if you're a leader, because ultimately the distraction from everything else. I don't know if that's a shared view. It's not a particularly well formed view by me, but that's certainly some of the thought that I've been having when looking at it from the outside.
I'm not sure about the idea that it's a distraction from the Epstein files, just because there isn't any direct evidence of it. I mean, it might be, but I'm not convinced. It's not like there's anybody from his inner circle that have kind of leaked that sort of information or so on. It's an assumption that we're all making. Might be the right assumption, but I'd like to see some kind of evidence of, discussions behind the scenes or paperwork that kind of proves it. We might never see that sort of thing. Doesn't mean it's not true, I guess. But I don't think it's the sort of thing we can report as truth, is it, basically?
No, I quite agree. I don't think you can report it as truth. I mean, it's speculation, clearly, but also the motives of why they've gone to war now. That's also all speculation, because I think one of the issues around it is it doesn't really make a huge degree of sense from from any kind of sensible US security strategy. I say that in air quotes, in terms of what conventional US policy towards the Middle East has been. Yes, they're quite happy, the US government, to bomb whoever they like, whenever they like. But the timing of this is very odd from the point of view of where the US is at, and also some of the activities that certainly the Israeli Air Force is engaged in. I mean, I think the US administration has said in the last few days that they didn't sign off on a number of attacks that have taken place that they now feel that, went too far, etc. And obviously the stuff around what's happened in the Straits of Hormuz and the energy stuff, I don't think that is something that the US government would have wanted to take place. So I agree. I think we're in the realm of speculation. I think that's the problem. It's such a strange thing for the US government to have done. Maybe, maybe with the case of Trump, who styled himself the president of peace, which I never thought was particularly plausible, but he did style himself as that.
There was this allegation that they were bumped into it by Israel, wasn't there? There was this allegation that they found out that Israel was going to attack, and they thought, right, we better attack as well. And also, that was right. I mean, this time 3 weeks ago, there were peace talks going on, and we know that there were Americans there and British people there. Jonathan Powell, representative for Keir Starmer, who was in the margins of those talks, have come back and said, well, it looked like Iran was about to do a deal. So it's all very odd, the timing of it. And again, we'll have to wait and see what comes out of that. But someone resigned from the White House a couple of days ago, didn't they, on that very issue? Anyway, I'm gonna keep. We must hear from Constance. I don't know if Constance has got a view on all of this.
No, thank you. But I've got nothing but speculation and tried comments. So no, I'll keep well clear of this one, but thanks.
No, I'm going to keep clear.
We do well with speculation and tried comments. I've made a living off tried comments. That's why I prefer short form social media. That's what I'm all about. Tried comments.
Well, we said we were gonna disagree tonight, so here we go. Let's go for it. Let's go.
Would you want to try comments to disagree over it? Yeah, I could file with them. No, just actually, we're not going to disagree. I was just going to agree with your point about 3 weeks ago. What was going on 3 weeks ago? I think, the issue around they were about to get a deal. I think one of the things that has been speculated about fairly widely is it's almost like they didn't want a deal. So the fact that Iran was actually prepared to come to the table and agree on quite a lot of the heads of agreement was actually something that provoked the war. Provoked is the wrong word, but triggered the war in the sense that, well, the Americans didn't really want a deal. So once it became clear that there was a real possibility they might get one, then that influenced the time a little bit. And to your point, I agree entirely. No, we're not going to disagree on this, John, much as we might want to try. But I do agree with you in terms of the issue around this narrative that Israel was going to anyway, and therefore we have to be involved. Marco Rubio said that. The Secretary of State said that a few weeks ago. No, or last week. And so they've been on the record. They've tried to walk that back, but they've been on the record. I think the interesting thing from someone who lives in East Anglia, which is an unusual perspective, but the interesting thing is someone who lives in East Anglia is the amount of American military hardware that went into East Anglia in the weeks immediately prior to the attack. So obviously folks will know, because I go on about it all the time, but folks will know that the US Air Force has a major presence in East Anglia at 2 bases, including nuclear weapons at one of them, we believe. But they were using in particular as a staging area for aircraft that were flying to Israel to be deployed out of Israel and other locations. And so there was a lot of stuff moving in there in that period. Doesn't mean obviously we benefit hindsight, we can't say that they were definitely going to attack, but nonetheless they were amassing a lot of stuff in that period. But yeah, I mean, on the UK position on it though, John, I mean, the UK has tried to carve out its own specific path, hasn't it? Which is kind of a difficult one for the UK, isn't it? Because the legacy of what the UK likes to call a special relationship and so on. And, I think it is interesting the way in which they've tried to carve that out.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of refreshing, isn't it? That we're not simply rushing headlong to support whatever an American president does. I think France has got a better history of that over the years. Whereas Britain has kind of been seen as America's poodle or whatever. And for once, Starmer has done something that is popular in terms of not going in straight away, really frustrating Reform and the Conservatives. And I think, he's been proven right in some regards. So first of all, there's 2 reasons for his position, or as he stated them. which is that he wasn't convinced of the legality of the war. Well, I don't think any of us could be convinced of the legality. I think we can be convinced of the illegality in international law of what the Americans have done. It's harder to be convinced of the legality. And he also said he couldn't see what the end goal was of this, which is exactly what we were just talking about. And I think on those 2 points, he's right. I mean, it's a little bit more nuanced. He hasn't criticized America or Trump directly. And indeed, he continues to criticize Iran's response, which Iran's response is probably also illegal in international law as well, because they have not just sought to widen the conflict, they have widened the conflict. They've attacked neighboring countries and countries nearby and so on. So, but the UK has ended up with a slightly more nuanced position than they normally do. And one of the interesting things I always think about in relation to foreign affairs is that it can be a very useful place for prime ministers who are struggling to go to. Foreign affairs can be quite helpful if you are doing very badly in the polls and your party is trying to get rid of you and plotting behind your back, or even right in front of your face. Getting involved with things that are popular abroad or in foreign affairs can be useful. It can also backfire horrendously. But I get the feeling that part of this has shown Starmer that there's something that could be useful for him, at least in the short term, which is interesting, I think, because he is in a deep lot of trouble. There is speculation daily now about him being replaced after the local elections go badly in the first week of May. But still, the Labour Party doesn't really have anyone to replace him as yet. So it all ties up with that too, which is quite interesting, I think.
No, I think it is right. It is interesting the need that they've carved out, because they are walking a tightrope, aren't they? But Constance, just for comparison, what is how has the French manifested itself prior to the conflict, and not just in relation to Iran, but also in relation to other things, like, for example, Ukraine and Greenland and other areas. Macron has styled himself as this kind of international statesman who's got people on the end of the phone, and he's able to reach people across divides and so on. That's very much the way he styled himself internationally. What's the French public sphere's view of happening and response to the French government and the state French government's made?
Yeah, so as you were saying, first of all, as France, there's a different tradition, and the immediate response to a US-led war like this one is, of course, one of deep skepticism, and especially the circumstances in which it was made. So I think it was a bit of a no-brainer, and it also connects with what John was saying just now about foreign policy is or can be a low-hanging fruit. And it's particularly true for Macron, who has been so marginalized in national politics. As we know, he's just deeply unpopular. Who knows whether he's even trying, considering he can't run for office a third time in next year's election. But historically, in the constitution of the Republic, the international sphere is a key area of presidential interventions. That's one area where he's still, trying to project this image, and that's fairly successful. He's had his moments. Obviously, there was the big recent one, the foreshore sunglasses and all of that, trying to really capitalize on this. And I think the message is still effective. So you'd have to go on a case-by-case basis, because with Ukraine, I think it's obviously it's a very different war, and there's still a huge amount of support, I think, within civil society, and a great deal of solidarity, including for Zelensky himself. And so quite a different mindset. And I think, like Britain, a sort of rapidly progressing militarization of society, and very, very much a government-led process as well, which is another concern.
Yeah, that militarization point you raised, Constance, something we've talked about on the news review before in different contexts in relation to going back a while, Ukraine, and more recent, some of the other things that have been happening in the world. It does seem, Britain is not part of the European Union, but it does definitely seem to be a pan-European phenomenon at the moment. Militarization of society, and or certainly the rhetoric of it. That we need to get ready for war, we need to do this, we need to do that. There needs to be investment in arms, there needs to be etc. Obviously, as anarchists, we have a certain view on that, but nonetheless, that is the common consensus in Germany, in the UK to some degree, in France. Is the left able, or is it is the anarchist left, the left generally able to make arguments against that to get a hearing in France? Because actually in the UK it's very difficult to make those arguments these days. I think we're seeing that a little bit with some of the criticism I think that Zach Polanski's getting, because Zach Polanski's obviously doing very well in the UK at the moment, relatively speaking. The thing they're trying to pick on is his position on NATO or otherwise. That's the kind of default that they go to. Is there a counter narrative in France in terms of actually militarization actually causes wars or not? Is it just been silenced?
Well, I think I have been. Obviously, it all depends on where you're getting your information. My sense would be that the situation in France is so critical on so many fronts. And I think even anarchists and lots of anti-parliamentary groups are caught up with what's happening with parliamentary politics, because the situation is so concerning. And the far right really is on multiple doorsteps to multiple sites of power. So obviously there has been a great deal of debate around this, but anti-fascist mobilization do seem to be in the foreground, and international solidarity. Now, anti-militarization, I've heard the odd radio program. As often, it tends to be crystallized by the sort of daily political news. So a few months ago, very high-ranking civil servants, a military man, issued a message saying, "Oh, you have to be ready, arm up. Some people have to be ready for the fact that their children will die." And this caused a massive stir, understandably, especially when after a bit of probing, people started thinking, well, actually, you couldn't have a high-ranking military figure in post issuing these kinds of messages without support from the president himself. So I think this is when you see a more open discussion. I think the criticism is there. Whether at the moment this is a priority, I suspect it will happen as inevitably the calls to arms become stronger, it becomes more mainstream, it's fully integrated into the mainstream political agenda, particularly on the left and center, and then I think we'll probably see a far more coordinated response.
Just there's a nice segue there, if I can, Constance, to some of the issues that we wanted to talk about tonight, which is obviously, the way I've framed it in the title of the show is the demonization of the anti-fascist movement in France at the moment, which is a live thing, which is a really serious thing, and it's happening at exactly the same time as there is electoral contest at the moment, where clearly the National Rally are doing very well, relatively speaking, and so on. Can you just introduce that for us, for those who may be not so familiar with what is actually happening? Because we have covered in Freedom a few weeks ago the killing of Quentin Durand, I think it was. We have covered that a few weeks ago, but for viewers who are maybe not so familiar with this, what is actually happening, and how is it that anti-fascists in France are being marginalised just in this political moment?
Wow. Okay, you'll have to ask me a question to make sure I disentangle this fully. But basically, so this fascist activist who happens to be young, but see, I do have to refrain from using the term because the media messaging about young Quentin being killed. So Durand was a 23-year-old far-right activist, and that's a very all-encompassing term for all sorts of really sinister associations with neo-Nazi groups, all sorts of nativists, royalists, you name it, groups, was killed in Lyon in circumstances, so mid-February, circumstances to be elucidated, and it took a bit of time on unraveling. So this within days or even hours, it was asserted that Antifa groups and activists were responsible for the death. And in particular, some of them being connected with a political party, which is, I think, the sort of French spin, and which is why it's so deeply entangled with the electoral cycle and with parliamentary politics. This group being La France Insoumise, Les Insoumis, the rebels. So the group, which is, or the party, which is increasingly and now actually normally described as extreme left, radical left. I was asked yesterday when doing a talk whether they were communists. You know, their main figure, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, is a former socialist. So, you know, there's there's a lot of interesting messaging around them. So very quickly, the discussion moved to La France Insoumise having these connections with Antifa, with anti-fascist groups, and anti-fascists are dangerous. Now, if we step back, first of all, there's the circumstances in which de Rank died, which very, well, quickly, but with some serious independent media investigation, turned out to be the result of an ambush led by a host of other far-right groups, starting with the, I want to get the term right, the French term is fémo-nationaliste, so ethno-feminist, but basically a far-right feminist grouping or women's led grouping called Nemesis. That's an interesting program in itself. So they sort of ambushed the anti-fascist groups, and this resulted ultimately in de Rank's death. But these, we are talking here about groups which have been fighting in the streets of Lyon for years. Lyon, France's second city, is a well-known hotbed of far-right activism. The population in many areas is terrified, and anti-fascist groups have been on the streets fighting back. No doubt about this. This one ended up with the death of de Rank. And then there was this incredible public response to the death of de Rank, no doubt with some heavy lifting from the mainstream media, a great deal of which, as we know, is sponsored by far-right media barons, starting with Vincent Bolloré. You know, they have TV channels, they have newspapers, they have radios, they have book publishers, they even have the booksellers in every French train station. So we have a very, very strong media apparatus here. And this ended up with a minute of silence in Parliament, and some really heavy stigmatization of La France Insoumise, basically with calls for resignation. But where things have taken, things have taken an interesting turn in the past week is with the local municipal elections in France. I think only in France could you get a municipal election, which becomes so riveting. If I say this, because it turned out the first round, the second round is happening next week, just was a good breakthrough, as expected, for the Rassemblement National, the national rally. What was really unexpected is that La France Insoumise has done well, really, really well, and held out or even progressed in many areas, and this in spite of the Antifa sort of stigmatization, criticism, you know, very much aligned. And that's perhaps something we can pick up with what's happening in the US. And I don't see so much in the UK. Of course, it is there, but this inversion of the rhetoric. And I think a great deal of interesting work has gone on as well in France to try and set the record straight, and a great deal of work by historians trying to explain what Antifa is and really is, and what it has meant historically in France as well, but in Spain as well. So we can come back to this. And I'll finish with this. What is really interesting is that La France Insoumise are still really using the term Antifa to describe themselves and say, you know, we are the anti-fascist party. And that, I think, is quite heartening, perhaps not in the current political climate, but it just, perhaps that's a sort of a boundary to the process of hyper stigmatization, well, until it goes legal, US style, but we're not quite there yet.
Constance, thanks so much for that, because like that, I think that was a really good whistle-stop tour of everything that's been going on and why this is so important. And also, I think the conclusion piece where you talked about actually how different it is that some people are prepared to still use the words and seize the words and not allow themselves to be rhetorically driven out of the vocabulary, if you like. You know, speaking from, you know, I did a piece, I can't remember which was, I think it was a couple of months ago for Freedom, because I do the radical reprint column where we find a piece from back in the day and I write a commentary, and because I'm verbose sometimes the commentary is longer. But I did a piece a couple of months ago that was quite close to my heart, which was where we found an old piece by one of the members of the collective who'd written a piece basically saying, anarchists, and we need to call ourselves anarchists, and it's important we call ourselves anarchists because of this reason. And that was many decades ago. And I know we've had this conversation in different settings as well. Obviously, we've particularly talked about anarchist violence, which I know you're very, you know, very familiar with on the scholarly level. You know, what happens if you allow terms to be defined by your opponents and what that means politically for you. So it's really hard, actually. It's really, l'offense insoumise is not prepared to cede the ground on Antifa. I think that is really positive, actually, in a sense, because actually I think one of the difficulties we have, particularly in England, actually, with left in general, and not just anarchists, but the left in general, is allowing our lines to be defined for us by others. And that then creates huge problems because you get driven out of political debate. John, obviously you've been in the election campaign. I always bring that up, and you brought it up as well, so it's all good. But you've been in an election campaign. You've obviously, you know, done that as a kind of intervention, as a sort of, you know, as an anarchist doing intervention. But you've clearly been on the receiving end of being narrativized in particular ways and rhetoric being used. I mean, in the UK, when we look at France and we compare and contrast, you know, do you see any kind of pushback against the way this language is happening in the mainstream? Because I don't see many people standing up for us. I mean, not that I'm expecting them to, of course, but I don't see many people standing up for us in Parliament and saying, actually, the anarchists aren't a bad lot or the anti-fascists aren't a bad lot, you know?
No, the very best we can hope for is that we're not directly attacked, I think. If you remember about 10 years ago, around about 10 years ago, Theresa May was changing definitions of what extremism was, and she made a decision not to include anarchists in that, which at the time I was thinking, well, we've done all right here. We're not going to be included in a list of extremists. But you know that threat is always there. I mean, I think if you put yourself forward as a candidate in a general election, you're gonna get flack. You have to just accept it. I mean, I had a little bit of a gig with a Croydon web news website where they allowed me to write the occasional column, and then once the election campaign got started, they called me the oxymoronic anarchist candidate in every single article that they wrote about me. But also, you know, I found out after the election that a guy in the National Front had reported me for election expenses irregularities, which I don't think there were any, but he reported me anyway. So clearly there were fascists who were looking into what I was doing, but I never received anything, you know, direct at all. When Constance was talking about it, I was just minded actually to compare it with the USA, because of course Antifa has become a word used regularly by Republicans, not just, well, are Republicans far right? I think we're beginning to take the view that they are. So, you know, Trump supporters have weaponized that word as if it's an organization, haven't they? And, you know, I think they're going through the process of kind of prescribing it as some kind of extremist group, aren't they? So I don't know if there's are the far right in France kind of using the same playbook, or is it similar but different? How is it working?
I think it is largely similar, and we know obviously that Steve Bannon is on the case in France and very closely connected with the Le Pen family. So I think it is that these are transnational strategies. I mean, we talk about transnational networks, and despite calling themselves patriots, the French far right are especially well connected internationally with heavy influence. So I think it is similar, not perhaps so mainstream yet, but so yesterday, and again, I was thinking about what you were saying, Mike, about resistance, and I was thinking actually about something else that connects with my research, which is about those sort of reputational campaigns and reputational self-defense organizing that anarchists can be part of to resist this wave of propaganda. And basically, in France, some really brilliant people who may not be anti-fascist, but obviously relate to the values, have really put in a lot of work. And this includes some really prominent historians. So if we think obviously about what happened in the US to Mark Bray, I think historians here are in the limelight. It's highly political. So in France, you have probably one of the most famous historians in the country, Johann Chapoutot, who is a world-leading historian of Nazism, who's been giving interviews everywhere. And his big thing is comparing historical events with the contemporary ramifications of neoliberalism and how it embodies itself in political institutions. Nicolas Offenstadt, who's a really famous historian of the of East Germany and the Cold War, and they have been on really not mainstream, but history programs on sort of France Culture, which is like the French BBC4. And yesterday, predictably, Le Figaro, which is France's, right stroke far right daily, had a hit piece on them saying, these historians dreaming up fascism and things like that. But it was quite interesting that you'd get excellent, highly learned radios and radio programs, and the people doing these shows, like say the French Melvin Bragg, saying, well, we're going to run a whole series, like a whole week of programs on the history of anti-fascism, and other outlets relaying this. And I think it has really worked. And in terms of politics, I was thinking as well about what's happening in Marseille is probably the main risk now for the far right. The France Insoumise candidate and the Rassemblement National candidate are neck and neck for next week, for Sunday. And if Marseille falls, I mean, it's a nightmare. The life of Marseillaise, this heavy immigrant component in the population, it's going to be absolutely tragic and dangerous. But the LFI candidate has withdrawn, and he said, anti-fascism, we need to resist and to unite against fascism. And he's really reneged on his own political ambition and given his vote, so to speak, to the Socialist Party. And I thought, this is really interesting here, the sort of, the different types of groups which it takes actually to unite and to push back on the messaging. But I'm not sure how long this can last in the face of the propaganda machine that is at work there. Sorry, long reply.
No, for my part, I thought that was fascinating. I think the point you make about the propaganda machine right at the end as well, because, there's something we have spoken about in different contexts on this show a number of times, certainly in the time that I've been on, is what you were saying about how networked the far right is now, and how many assets they have in different public spheres in terms of basically more or less domination in the mainstream media landscape. When we look at the US, there's been a lot of conversation over the past months of how much more concentrated that power is getting, even in the US, with very strong Trump loyalists buying out various media organizations. Obviously big conversations about Paramount and some of the other big groups over there. And essentially we've seen in the US what that means, not just in terms of outright propaganda, but also censorship. In terms of, in the US, we've seen Stephen Colbert has had his show cancelled. Obviously Jimmy Kimmel was taken off. And we're anarchists. We're not of the same politics as Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel. By the way, I'm not the kind of anarchist that is so sectarian that I won't shake hands with somebody who's also, I think, broadly speaking, trying to do the right thing. So, you know, if Stephen Colbert says something I agree with, which he does a lot of the time, then I agree with him. I support his right to say so. But the point, those shows were pulled off basically because of censorship. You know, Colbert's show is ending. There are lots of, and the other thing is, we get that in the UK because, you know, in the UK we know Stephen Colbert is. We see the clips on the internet, etc. We get that. But actually, if you dig down into US media, I used to live in the US, not for that long, but I know the US landscape a little bit. It's happening at all levels of the US media landscape, which is really scary. And one of the other things in the US is the US has a big tradition of regional media. Obviously, these networks are owned by conglomerates in most cases when it comes to broadcast, but also regional print media still exists in the US in a big way, in a way that's declined elsewhere in the world. And those are also find themselves in these sorts of positions. And so, to your point about propaganda machine, you know, it's great that in France there's this counter narrative being put out there, or there's, it's actually not even a counter narrative. There's analysis, there's proper analysis happening, there's scholarly intervention in politics in a meaningful way. But actually, in spaces like the US and the UK, I mean, in the US, it seems to be very, very difficult at the moment. In the UK, there seems to be very little resistance in the mainstream. You know, it seems very difficult in the mainstream to get room for those sorts of views. I don't know if you agree, John, or if you think that actually the picture's a little bit better. Maybe, I don't know.
Are you talking about getting a wider a wider array of voices in the mainstream?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So just to take
I
Constance's point,
mean,
take an example, take a specific example and compare and contrast. You know,
yeah,
Constance mentioned Melvin Bragg and meant basically in our
yeah, yeah,
time, right? But we might get a one-off show on the Haymarket Martyrs or something, or we might get a one-off show, Root go on and do an anarchism show or whatever. But we
yeah.
don't get a seven-part series on
No,
anti-fascism in, you know,
no.
on BBC Two, say, or something like that. That's
The,
not going to happen, you know.
there's a really good BBC website where you can basically trawl through their archive, and so you can put in search terms like anarchism or anarchist or particular names and see what programs crop up. Uh, you can spend hours doing it, and I have. And you know, there are some really interesting things out there. Some that you can find out. So there's a couple of In Our Time episodes. One about anarchism in general. One about Kropotkin. One of our founders, and someone has written on the YouTube chat. Good to see that freedom is still going. Yeah, 140th anniversary this year, in fact. So yeah, still going. So there are some programs out there. There's a documentary talking about Graeber that was done a few years ago. But then you kind of have to go quite a long way back to see anarchist voices regularly. People like Alex Comfort, perhaps, or who had a very strange relationship with the BBC once they found out he was both a pacifist and an anarchist. That was basically, you know, a really tricky thing. And Colin Ward. Colin Ward appears on programs talking about town planning, and there was a kind of acceptance that anarchists might be in the public arena. They might be, you know, and of course we've had like famous artists and musicians, and you know, there's a variety of people that have been out there as anarchists, but it just doesn't happen so much anymore. And I think some of it is just the way that anarchism has become perceived by the mainstream. In terms of news, we're not going to move from here to the BBC studios. We you know, no matter what I think, I'm going to be organising an election night special on freedom rather than going to the BBC studios to talk about it. Yeah, I don't know how we change that. I don't know how it changes. And one of the things with news gathering that mainstream broadcasters are prone to do is, because so many of the serious journalists are actually working for newspapers. I had a student this week ask me whether physical newspapers still exist. Yes, go out and buy one. You know, the BBC will be looking at what the stories that the Times and the Guardian and the Daily Mail are producing in order to set their agenda. They're not going to be setting the agenda themselves anymore. And so that's a big change. And so we're not in those newspaper spaces. We're not going to be in those broadcast spaces, is the way I feel about it at the moment.
I mean, regarding, the whole conversation about Antifa and bringing in the Britain, my sense, and here it is speculation, I would say that we are likely to see a growth of the Antifa rhetoric as elections get nearer and reform possibly gains momentum. I think that's likely to happen, but my sense is that what's happening with Antifa, say in France and the US, I'm not saying the word is like warmly celebrated in the public sphere in the UK, but I think a lot of that sort of type of moral panic and manipulation has crystallized around the Gaza protest. And I think the anti-Semitism would be the UK equivalent for now. And that's been the big sort of public fear, and Antifa might not be as useful right now, but I'm sure it will become very useful in the not too distant future. And at this point, we'll probably move much closer to what's happening in the US and in France.
Just in terms of the immediate future, so the very short term, Constance, you were saying there's a result in Marseille on Sunday, is that right? Is that there'll be an outcome? One thing that occurs to me, and this is genuinely just a question born of ignorance, so I apologise for that, but it is a sincere question in that sense. One thing that gets narrativized to those of us who don't live in France and don't understand French political culture in any detail is there's constant precipice moments, there's constant moments when France is on the brink, right? And obviously Le Pen's presidential candidacies have been those, and, Macron was marketed to us abroad as, he was going to be the bulwark against this, and and obviously, those of us who don't know much about French political culture, probably didn't, probably saw that and he's a neoliberal and it's the way it's going to be, and but there do seem to be continuing these kind of crystallization points, these inflection points. This is the latest one. In terms of what you know of this, obviously you know a lot more about this than either of us do. If because we're not, as anarchists, we're not supposed to worry about electoral contests, but we do worry about electoral contests. As we said before, the ramifications that John's saying, certain parties will ban us, certain parties won't. We do exist in a world where states exist. We hate them, we want to get rid of them, but we do exist in them. What do you think are the short-term implications if it were to go that way? If SNL does win that election, what do you think the short-term implications are? How catastrophic might it be?
Yeah, it's a complete unknown because the whole national rally has done. It's had a massive image makeover over the past 20 years, which also explains this precipice thing. But each time it gets closer and closer. So if you look at the results of the presidential election, 2002. 2017, 2022, each time the second round of the election has been National Front or National Rally against another candidate, the margins are narrowing each time. And so this is a famous process known as de-devilification, normalization, and, there's a debate as to how cosmetic it is. It is no doubt heavily cosmetic. Whether there is any substance to it, I mean, if the municipal elections have shown us anything, is that really the local people voting for the party and local politicians and people running for council positions, they have connections with neo-Nazi group, with also to all the strands of the far right, historic, contemporary, some unsavory stuff on the street, everything you can imagine. So who knows? Who knows? It could go something akin to what's happening in the US. I mean, it's a complete leap into the unknown. I expect somebody might be able to uncover some internal documents to the party, see if they have a plan. Who knows? They might decide they quite like power and they want to stick to a nice sort of cozy parliamentary democracy-ish with heavy police presence, and they will have to act on all their xenophobic pledges. I mean, in Marseille, for instance, one of the measures they discussed was banning some areas of the city centre to people coming from certain neighborhoods, which is obviously a byword for non-white poorer populations. So, it can be a real blueprint, actually, for an openly far-right party capturing power in a Western democracy. And that, they are more open about it than Trump is historically. So it will be a laboratory of something sinister.
Yeah, and I think to your point about Trump, and I'll bring John in now rather than just wrap it on as I usually do. But to your point about Trump, Trump in a way is, kind of, Trump is this figure who is himself, isn't he? And he's got a movement behind him, which clearly is very ideological, but he himself is what he is. But on the other hand, this movement in France has consistently been what it is. John, sorry, you're going to come in.
Yeah, I was just going to say that when it comes to electoral politics, I wouldn't ever tell someone that they should vote or tell anybody, what to do, especially not in a different country. But what I would say is that we don't live in the 1800s anymore. And when anarchists were beginning to work out their opposition to electoral politics, very few people had the vote. And I think now we can, well, I feel as though we should have a movement that is nimble enough to work out that they can do things differently and they can use voting as a tactic without it affecting their purity of their anarchist intentions. But that will be for each individual to decide, I think. I don't think there needs to be like a common view or, a right way of doing things. But we should revisit the possibility that voting has the occasional plus side, or not voting can lead to bad things. Both of those things can be true, I think.
If I may, in solidarity with the people who find themselves physically at risk if the far right government with its, say, militia and heavy police presence comes to power. And there have been debates actually among sort of anarchist groups in France in the heyday of Twitter. There's a famous French political scientist called Samuel Hayat, who did some really good work explaining that no, not all things are equal. Actually, when you have really dangerous parties on the brink of power, then yes, it is fine to vote.
I'm so going to ask a geek question. Sorry, folks, I'm just going to pause myself. Is that the Samuel Hayat who did the work on the International? Because Hayat, is it? Yeah. But yeah, anyway, I remember a good essay on the International. Yeah, fantastic. No, one question I wanted to ask you, Constance, while we've got you, is just actually to flip the script a little bit on the demonization of Antifa to the mainstreaming of the right, and from that point of view, because that's a process we're seeing everywhere, and the propaganda machine, as you say, is doing that. And in the UK and in the US, we've seen what I think, and I think a lot of the scholars who are more qualified talk about it, like Aaron Winter, really, and Mond, and people like this, say is the weasel words of populism. We'll call the far right populist, we'll call the left X, Y, and Z. Is that the same playbook that's operating now in terms of what's happening post Durant's killing? Because you said there was a minute's silence in Parliament and all this sort of stuff. Is it the same sort of thing? The culmination mainstreaming over a long time.
I mean, I don't know if it's exactly the same process, but yes, I mean, what happened after the minute of silence in Parliament, it turned out, it was revealed again through independent media work that actually Durant had been involved in something, that there had been opportunities to rescue him. So enough embarrassing news, or nuanced news, shall we say, to complexify the picture and really bring concern over that minute of silence, particularly as, and I haven't mentioned this, it's proven, it's established that there have been far more victims on the streets from far-right violence than de Rank, who is the one person allegedly to have been killed by a left-wing, far-left group. So very uneven recognition only for this one victim. And there was no backtracking after that. I think that for me, there's a sense of something has happened that cannot be undone. There was a bit of, saying, oh, we are not crying for a political figure, we are crying for a young life lost and this kind of stuff. So I think it's something to do with its stakes, and lets things stick. And finally, to close that loop, and again, the specificity of France is probably that political parties are so involved in it, and particularly La France Insoumise on the left. The rhetoric has really shifted now, and on the mainstream media and center parties, the rhetoric is increasingly, we need to fight the extreme left, the far left. So we've gone full circle, and the real danger is allegedly those left-wing parties, or this specific left-wing party.
And in a sense, at the risk, and trying not to be too trite, but at the risk of a trite historical comparison, there is a certain sense of, whilst on the same time, there's a modern form of mainstream which is very different, to what we've seen in the past. If you look at the classic fascist playbook, if you go back to Italy in the early 1920s, Germany a little bit later, although it started in the early 1920s, the classic playbook was, oh, look, society is becoming destabilized by these leftists. We need to crush these leftists in order to provide order. That was very much the Mussolini template. I know that's slightly different because obviously that was meted out on the streets. That's a different kettle of fish. But the idea of the left as some sort of existential threat, and that the extent to which that is accepted by the mainstream is interesting to me, particularly given that in previous times when that's been narrativized in that way, the left has actually had some sort of chance of power. There's been situations when the left, if you go back to the period, obviously you study Constance, the period around the sort of fin de siècle of, the 19th century, that period, anarchism in that time, a lot of anarchists were very positive because they thought the revolution was around the corner, right? They were viewed as a credible threat. I remember a quote I was interviewing Freedom in the 60s, where, if I think one of the anarchists says, if we're being monitored by the police, well, it means we're relevant again. Whereas in those periods, we were a meaningful, powerful presence. Whereas now we're being, there's this demon being conjured up in the form of Antifa that is spectral in a lot of places, not to denounce the good work that is done by anti-fascists everywhere, of course. But in terms of being played up as this kind of, epic force that's about to take over the entire country, clearly that's a figment of the imagination, but it's one that's finding huge perch amongst some folks. I'm conscious we're coming up on our hour. I just want to do a couple of little shouts of accounts. We've had quite a lot of comments. Firstly, comments endorsing my hair, very welcome, appreciate it, many thanks for that. It doesn't happen by itself. A temple isn't built in a day, so appreciate that with the hair there. Also, a couple of shout outs also about some folks who were famous actors who did make it into the mainstream. Sham of 6394 saying George Melly, those of you know George Melly, the musician, and Sham are also making the point that George Melly was allowed in the public sphere because he was a musician and he was called a musician. He wasn't called an anarchist. And again, he was actually a participant in that same interview in the late 60s that I was talking about. And he's got a lovely line in that, I think, if I remember rightly, where he's asked by a BBC interviewer, are you an anarchist, or something to that effect? It might not be exactly that, but they're asked, group, are you anarchist, or what is anarchism for you, or something? And George Melly goes, I am an anarchist. I am a Sternerites, a conscious egoist. Not my kind of anarchism, but George Melly definitely knew what kind of anarchist he was. But to John's point as well, that, Colin Ward was quite happily let loose on town planning programmes but he wasn't really allowed to promote himself as an anarchist overtly in that space. So yeah, there were some around. Also, Shammer also mentioned Louis Theroux hasn't really shown any interest in the most extreme political movement going. I think that means us. Yeah, Louis Theroux doesn't want to hang out with us anarchists because I think sitting in a bookshop over tea might be a bit too retro for Louis. I think he wants something with a little bit more hit value. And then also Nick Northcott. In Austria, Germany, you have groups like Almost Gegen Rechts. I don't speak German, I don't speak English really, but I do my best. Grannies Against the Far Right, which I think is awesome. So there's a Grannies Against the Far Right group in the German-speaking world. And on that note, I'm going to offer solidarity to the grannies because we all need to defeat the far right. Constance, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been absolutely wonderful, and it's been great to hear from somebody who is an expert, particularly on the situation in France as well, because it's a perspective we don't often get. John, great as always to have you, mate. Thank you so much for coming on board. And thank you, the rest of you, for letting me waffle. So thanks so much to everyone.
Can I just say that my hair did do itself over the course of the day, whereas you put a lot of work into yours. So well done.
Thank you.
What a great way
to be fair, the magic just happens with you, John. You know, those of us who are more follically challenged, we have to work at this stuff. Do you know what I mean? Cheers.
Okay.
Thanks, both.
Thanks so much.
It was great. Thanks.